I'm going to try in a few minutes to kind of, I don't know, eliminate or explain the, the alphabet soup that is the designation of Porsche cars since the beginning. We've talked about 911S and T, and I'm going to talk about STs and GTSs and RSs and Group 1s and 2s and 3s and LMP prototypes, LMP 1s and 2s. All of these things basically have to do with racing categories and with homologating the car for racing. The opening image is just sort of something to have on the screen, but it actually was done by Jürgen Barth's wife Ursula as a Christmas present for him because he was spending so many long nights in the wind tunnel. She knew he was sleeping on the floor, and so she created for him a little 930 turbo pillow. This is one of the oldest 911 race cars still going. It's actually a 901, and it raced in 1964 in Germany. This was at Rennsport this last session. Porsche's first official racing efforts were in a car they referred to as the 911 MC from Monte Carlo Rally. And the guy on the left is Peter Falk. That's Herbert Linge. Falk was a director of competition. Linge was a test driver, racing mechanic, and became a really, really fine race driver. That's basically a prototype 911S in January 1965. The other thing that Porsche really pushed, because Ferry Porsche believed in the public relations value of racing, was these hill climbs. They were short bursts. This is Eberhard Mahler doing the Schauensland hill climb, which was all of about 4 miles long, but it was up a road that steep, but it got lots of newspaper coverage. And so if Porsche won it, Porsche is a company that has experience with that old statement, race wins on Sunday, bring sales on Monday. Eberhard Mahler, again, this time in 1966, pardon me, the Monte Carlo Rally is with this navigator on one of the snowy sections of the rally. And there they are finishing the rally. 4 nights later, they started at Frankfurt and ended up in Monte Carlo. These were called the MCs. They were, in fact, prototype 911Ss. And as you know with Porsche, S stands for super. It still stands for that with the 911 Carrera and Carrera S today. In 1965, Vic Elford, rally driver, wonderful character, approached Huschke von Hanstein and said, "Huschke, I'd like to drive a rally car for you." And Huschke looked at him and said, "Okay, lad, I think we can have a car for you. How about Corsica?" Elford said, "That sounds fine. Could I have a training car?" "Yeah, of course, we'll send you a training car," which was a VW Beetle. So Vic and David Stone, his navigator, went to Corsica, drove the Beetle around, and 3 days before the rally began, Huschke arrived with the Volkswagen Transporter towing this car on an open trailer. 1966 911. Car was on the trailer. Elford got there and said, "Ah, great, Huschke car looks fine." Opened the doors of the transporter and it was filled with wheels and tires. Elford said, "Well, gosh, Huschke, that's great, but what about the spares?" "Oh, Vic, young man, you don't understand. Porsches don't break. We don't need spares." Vic was a little dodgy because he'd just come from 2 seasons driving Fords that never didn't break. That car didn't break. Elford basically had his first class victory in a rally in that car, Corsica 1966. An American racer called Bruce Jennings became one of the first to get an S in the US. This was his car. He won East Coast championships in this car, and then went on to do ever and ever and ever greater things in an official 911S. This is the official 911R. We've talked about the Rs today. The R is kind of this mythical beast within Porsche history. It was the brainchild of a guy called Ferdinand Piëch, whose name you probably recognize with all the recent Volkswagen excitement. But Piëch is a brilliant engineer, and his idea with this car was to see how strong you could make a car, how light you could make a 911, how durable you could make a 911. So this is the car at a maniacal event called the Marathon de la Route. It makes the 24 hours of Le Mans seem like a warm-up session. This race begins in Liège, Belgium. They drive to the Nürburgring. They run 4 days, 84 hours, 3.5 days, 84 hours on the Nürburgring, and then they drive back to Liège. The rules are so arcane that mechanics at the track gas pumps are the only ones who can fill the tanks. Mechanics in the pits are the only ones who can change tires, but the drivers are the ones who have to do repairs. So if something on the cars break, they try to get themselves back to the pits, but to stay on the outside of the pits, because timeout happens when you refuel, and timeout happens when you get new tires. But if you have to make a repair in the pits, that's time that's taken from your total. So this is Jochen Nierpasch getting fuel, 1967 911R, with the Sportomatic transmission. Porsche was trying to promote the Sporto for sales in Europe. Vic Alfred was the co-driver. He loved the Sporto so much that when he had a chance to order his company car, his 911 for 1968 season, he insisted on getting a Sporto. This is you saw this earlier in Tony's slideshow. This is 911R number 001. This is at Monza, and it was basically one of the only events that was even longer and more brutal than the Marathon de la Route. In October of '67, 4 Swiss drivers, Rico Steinemann, Dieter Sperry, Charles Vogela, and of course Joe Seifert, decided to see if they could set a series of European and world speed records on the closed bank circuit at Monza, 2.5-mile lap. They used the 906 Longtail that belonged to Steinemann and Sperry, but the car broke. The banking was so severe and so severely eroded that it just broke the chassis. It stuck the outside rear shock absorber through the body. They had sanctioned this whole thing through the FIA, so the FIA sent inspectors and timing people and course judges and all of this stuff, and the rules allowed them 24 hours to restart. Steinemann had a very good reputation and rapport with the factory, and he called the factory and he said, help. Well, while the factory loved hill climbs and of course endurance races, it really didn't have much truck with time trials because nobody read about them, there were no spectators, and they didn't really think it did much for the company. So Ferdinand Piëch said, oh, I don't care, just send them 3 Rs. So they took the first 3 Rs, 01, 02, and 03, and they dedicated them to the project. Number 1 was the car they specially prepared. They pulled in a new engine, what they thought was a new engine off the shelf, installed it. They took a whole bunch of spares from the shelves, jammed them into car number 2 and car number 3, and those two set off like bandits to get to Monza so that they could literally take apart the rest of the second car for spares, because those rules also required the driver had to do repairs with parts in the car, carried in the car during the timing event. So it's now Paul Hensler and Peter Falk driving the car to Monza, 001. Hensler was the head of engine production. He was the one who specified the engine they put in the car. And as they're driving out of the Zuffenhausen gates, Hensler's looking at the records and he sort of turns to Paul and he says, Paul, I think we might have a problem. It seems that the engine we just installed wasn't rebuilt. In fact, it just finished a 100-hour bench test. And they took it apart to test it and to measure it. And then they just reassembled it. They didn't rebuild it. It's not new parts. And Falk said, well, I hope we get to Monza. They got to Monza. They loaded the car with all the spares they thought it might need. The thing ran 96 hours without a hitch. And in the process, they set 17 world records, 16 of them for time and distance. And the 17th world record was for the number of tires consumed by a single car in 4 days. 128 Firestone tires. The Monza banking was brutal. But for years, the only photographs we had of this car were black and whites. And can you tell me what color those stripes are? Because the car's sponsor was British Petroleum, everybody presumed, well, you know, BP green, so the stripes have to be green. Tony and Tom got the car in. We're beginning to do a number of things of service and restoration to the car. And I kind of got obsessed by the story when I met Steinemann and Sperry. So I'd been following it and following it and following it, and I'd ask Jens Torner, who's the photo archivist at Porsche, does anybody really know what color it is? 'Cause I was there for 4 weeks on a research and interview trip, and the third from last day, Jens Torner chases me down in archives and says, Randy, you've got to come see, you've got to come see, I have Peter Falk's photographs. Falk had just retired in the week that I was there, and he turned over all of his files and all of his photographs to archives. And in there was a book of his Kodachrome slides, which showed that the stripes were red, which makes sense when you consider that the national colors of Switzerland, the home of the drivers, is red and white. So Tony made some allusions to it earlier this morning. Because nobody could tell and everybody thought it was BP sponsorship colors, the car first appeared out of restoration with green longitudinal stripes. And then when it showed up again, anew in red, let's just say there was some vocal dispute that finally got silenced by showing prints from Falk's slides. That's the role of a historian. It's the role of anybody who does anything that deals with history, is you just keep digging and digging and digging and digging and digging and digging and digging, and every once in a while you hit pay dirt. Falk's color slides solved so many riddles. 911R. It's another one of those things where Pierre used these cars to experiment the strength and the durability of what a 911 could do. He loaned one every racing event to the Nürburgring. And in this case, he loaned Herbert Linge to drive it as the medical car. And here you can see Linge with all, shall we say, all 4 legs akimbo in the air over one of the humps at Nürburgring with the track doctor as a passenger. This is Bruce Jennings' first 911S race car. Again, it showed up at Rennsport. This is another wonderful, wacky saga from Porsche racing history. 4 Polish racing teams decided that they wanted to contest the London to Sydney rally. A mere 10,000 miles overland, plus a 2,100-mile sea trip over 1 month. The 4 guys bought 4 911Ts from Porsche, the 4 teams, and then they prepared them for what they thought could be the worst possible considerations in Africa with those things that bounce around on 2 legs. So the whole thing is rigged with kangaroo bars, and then, as you'll see here, the wiring harness that goes up and over the front to keep kangaroo parts from crashing into the windshield, spare tires, spare wheels, spare bits. Only one of the 4 cars finished, but it finished 3rd overall. Now the other wonderful thing with this is that the prize for 3rd place was sponsored by a newspaper that had, a British newspaper that had outlets in Australia, in India, and in the UK. 3rd place prize was 3,000 British pounds. Now in 1966, 3,000 British pounds was about $5,400 US, which was about 3/4 of a year of average pay for a British worker. So for 1 month of insanity, these guys earned 9 months' wages. And this is the Marathon de la Route in 1968. These are 1969 GTSs. I told you about that acronym a moment ago. This was another Ferdinand Piëch exercise to lighten a car. This thing was so obsessively done that even the headlight buckets are aluminum. They made only 3. They drove them from Stuttgart to Liège to break them in, from Liège to the Nürburgring. It was Herbert Linge, Dieter Glemser, and Willi Kausen, who were the 3 drivers in this thing. 3 cars, 28, 29, and 30. Number 29 crashed early in the first night. 28 and 30 went on to soldier through the entire 84 hours. Number 28 won it And I told you about penalty points and penalty seconds. At the end of 84 hours, number 28 had 4 penalty seconds. It took maniacal driving skill. But I talked to Linga about it, and he said the worst thing about this car was that it was essentially built on a 911E chassis, which had the hydromatic suspension on the front end. And what Linga said was it was impossible to make the car stiff enough because the front end was like a sponge. So on acceleration, all those front end lights lit up the tops of the trees, and going down the hill and on braking, they lit up the pavement right in front of the tires. This is the 1969 ST team ready to go to Monaco. I won't say they detoured one to do the East Africa Safari Rally, but that was the first year that they ran an ST in Africa. The ST was, of course, a T chassis with all the S running gear. Another ST, that's Gérard Larousse, in a car prepared for the marathon, no, I'm sorry, for the Tour de France de l'Automobile. The automobile Tour de France is 4 years older than the bicycle race, founded in 1899, if you can imagine. And this is another maniacal European race. It generally starts in some city and does a lap of France. Its destination on each leg is a racetrack. There's a single driver. The only repairs allowed to the cars are on actual time events, either at the racetrack or on the road. Because you get to the track, and if it's nighttime, the car goes into a parc fermé, a secured parking lot. You can't touch it till the next morning. So every morning or afternoon, there's somewhere between an 85 and 150 mile race. And then there's what they call a transit leg, which is public roads in France. Supposedly not a race, but after all, it is an elapsed time event. 1969 ST prototype, ready to go to Monaco for the first event of the year. Sorry, that was 1970. This is the same car after Bjorn Valdegaard finished with it, taking first place at Monaco, but of course, bouncing off a rock or a bridge every once in a while. Valdegaard was one of Porsche's best rally drivers. He was born and raised in Sweden. He did all the Northern Lights rallies. He did all the Northern European rallies on insane surfaces in the winter. So he was very comfortable sliding around on icy, rocky roads and using the car itself as a bumper. That's Valdegaard winning at the end of the Monte Carlo, coming into the city of Monaco. This was Gérard Larousse's entry, a 911 ST for the 1971 Tour de France. Now the guys had a benchmark because with Ferdinand Piëch's 911R, they got the car down to 800 kilograms, 1,764 pounds. Larousse said, okay guys, that's good, but I have an idea. I give you 1 bottle of champagne for every additional kilogram you pull out. He ended up rewarding them with 11 bottles of champagne. This thing came in at 1,739 pounds. It's the lightest 911 that ever left Stuttgart. And oh, by the way, he won. That's Peter Gregg's first 911 race car. It's his very first venture with the Brumos blue and red color scheme. And his sponsor at the time was Gerard, who was a friend of his who made hi-fi turntables. East Africa Safari car, another 911 ST. Tony has mentioned that you should never believe the sponsorship stickers on the side of the car. And sometimes you should never believe what your eyes tell you, because yes, those are white wall tires. And that's how the car raced. This was the East Africa Safari Under for 1972. It had typical sponsorship. It had Shell, it had Trico Wiper Blades, it had a couple of other sponsors. The sponsor whose name didn't appear on the side of the car was Sears Roebuck, who had taken on worldwide marketing of Michelin all-weather radial tires, available in white walls and black walls. So when the cars set off to Nairobi, capital of Kenya, for the start, of course, they put real serious mud and snow tires on them. And when they ran white walls. Zoboslaw Zasada, I can almost never remember that name. He was the Polish guy who was the one Polish team that finished the London to Sydney race. Drove this car to second overall in the East Africa Safari on white walls. The beginning of a whole new era with this car. This is the 73 model year, Carrera 27 RS. They resurrected the name Carrera, as you know, from the 1950s, 356s, and really took it from the Carrera Panamericana, the race that Porsche entered and then successfully campaigned in 53, 54, and 55. I just recently found out that it was Harm Lagai who created the Carrera logo on the side of the car. It was his very first assignment as a designer straight out of Design University at Porsche. And they said, you young boy, you have good script. Write something graphic on the side of the car for the name. So as they were developing the cars, they created both the RS, which is the one in back, the street version, and the RS28, RSR28, pardon me, which was the competition version. You can sort of see a little bit of difference in the wheel flares and the depth of the rear wheels. It's kind of hard to see with that back one. A little better version to show you the difference in car width and certainly in front end, because the RSR had an oil cooler up front. There's Jürgen Barth driving the photo prototype with the earlier script pattern. And then that's how it appeared at the Frankfurt Auto Show in '72. And that's Jürgen driving the same sport proto that he took to Le Mans in '73. That's him driving his 1973 Le Mans car at Rennsport a year ago. 1973 RS, again going to Africa. We were sitting talking to a guy called Tilman Broadbeck, who was by that time the head of the exclusive department at Porsche. And I did my sort of, not death ray stare, but my kind of, I have no brain left compliant stare. And he said, do you know I invented the Bertzel? And I was with a guy called Michael Baumann, who was the head of Porsche Press, Porsche Marketing, Porsche News Information Service. And I turned to Michael and I said, did you know that? Baumann said, no, it's one of the great mysteries inside Porsche. And it's simply because no one had asked him. No one had said, hey, Tilman, you were in aerodynamics before. Do you know who did this? Well, the point of the story is not that it was Tilman, although how he accomplished it's a pretty cool story. But you see the Bertzel that's there on the back. It's this whole shape here. You all know it. One of the most startling shapes in automotive design, and it's become an iconic form, and I don't use that word very often. But it was highly, highly, highly controversial within Porsche. The marketing people said, it's ugly, it will never sell cars. You will destroy this car. The biggest advantage for it, of course, was the handling improvement, which all came out of a race at the Hockenheimring, where Ernst Fuhrmann watched drivers have trouble going through corners and lose corners to Fords and to BMWs. And Fuhrmann grabbed a young engineer who was there as part of the racing team and said, you, our cars are having trouble in corners. What are you going to do to solve it? And the young engineer turned about as white as the walls and said, I'll go talk to Herr Singer. And Singer said, that's a good idea, you solve this. Take the young aerodynamics guy and go into the wind tunnel. They were tired, they were lying on the floor trying to figure out what they could do at the bottom of the car to help. And Broadbeck started moving his finger across the lower part of the valence, from right below the bumper all the way down. When he got to the bottom, the oil wand, the smoke wand, the wind tunnel assistant aimed the smoke wand at Broadbeck's finger, and instead of the air going under the car, it immediately shot to the side. And they looked at each other and said, Eureka, or whatever the German equivalent is of, oh my God, we found it. They found a piece of rope in the wind tunnel, and they taped it to the bottom of the valence. And it immediately shifted all the air around the car and kept all the air from going underneath it. After only 3 days in the wind tunnel, they solved the front end lift. Went back in to solve the second problem, which was, okay, the air comes over the top of the car, and all of the designers and modelers working for FA Porsche, for Butzi at the time, they didn't really know enough about aerodynamics to really be concerned about laminar airflow or separation airflow, what happens at the back of the car. As they began playing with the smoke wand again, they tried to figure out how to get the air to hug the body and then lift off. And once again, Broadbeck's there, and he's raising his hand, and he's lowering his hand, and he's moving his hand up and down the back of the car, and all of a sudden he gets to this magic point right about midway on the rear deck lid, and you can watch the wand, the smoke wand, start to hug the car, hit his hand, and rocket off into space. So they did a number of tests over the next couple of days to develop the shape of the Wurzel and the height of the Wurzel, and they came up with something that was almost 10 inches tall. The way Porsche was set up at the time was anything that was going into production had to go to everybody's favorite beauty stylists, hairdressers in the beauty salon with Tony Lapine. So they sent it to Lapine, asked him to make it production ready, and when the thing came out and debuted for the Board of Supervisors meeting, it was the current height, which was about this instead of about that. And Peter Falk had been part of the final testing on it and the final development of dimensions. And he looked at the thing and he said, Herr Lapine, what happened to the Wurzel? Oh, it was too tall, it was ugly, we cut it down. So the shape that's there and the shape that ended up on all of them was cut in half by the styling department. Of course, they got it back when they went racing. They put the original height on, but then Norbert Singer had this idea about trying to wrap the spoiler all the way around the back end of the car. This car earned the nickname of the Mary Stuart collar because of the high neck collars that Mary Stuart, Queen of England, wore. And there's Mary Stuart jumping. Production Carrera 3.0. Racing Carrera 3.0, prototype Porsche Turbo 2.1. Ernst Fuhrmann was an engine man, and he believed that engines should do all the work of the car, and that you don't need wide wheels or wide bodies or wings or anything, because all of that stuff makes the car so wide and slows it down. Singer kept arguing with him. No, you don't understand, Professor Fuhrmann. We can go faster around the corners and we make up the speed we lose on the straightaway. Fuhrmann said, but does that wing have to be so big? I hate that big wing. I tell you what, you can do it, but you paint it black so no one will see it. That's our friend Pete Stout, driving one of his friend's RSR at Rennsport 5 years ago. That's our friend Mark Donahue, the late, driving one of the IROC Carreras. The IROC was a series of races that began in 1974. Using RS Carreras, it was a sort of a stacked race in that it was Roger Penske's innovation with the fellow who headed Mosport track. They were road racers, so they invited 4 road racers, 4 NASCAR drivers, and 4 IndyCar drivers to race this 4-race series in Porsche 911s. You can imagine how comfortable the NASCAR and IndyCar drivers were in Porsches. So at the end of the season, it was the 4 sports car drivers who finished first, second, and third. That guy was, of course, first. From that year on, for the next 15 years, they raced Camaros. 2 really great competitor brothers in sports car racing in Germany, Manfred and Erwin Kramer, were the first to buy RSRs for racing. These were their first 2 cars, racing again at Rennsport about 5 years ago. The 934. The 934 was the first racing version of the 930 Turbo. Because of the way homologation rules worked for turbochargers, the FIA decided that the power output effect of a turbocharger was 1.4 times what it would be if it were a normally aspirated engine. They then set weight limitations and other dimensional limitations on the cars based on all this formula of displacement times turbo, multiplied by the price of apples in Luxembourg. And these cars ended up with the equivalent of a 4.5-liter engine, so large a displacement that their racing weight had to be 2,800 pounds, which was so much heavier than the car could be that these things actually raced with electric windows. They gutted the cars, they pulled everything out of it that they could, and they ended up 150 pounds light. So that gave Norbert Singer the opportunity to put weight in the car where he wanted it. And one of the easiest things to do is, window regulators break. We stick with the electrics. It's about the same weight. They didn't run with air conditioning, though. That's the 930 Turbo at the Frankfurt Auto Show in September of '73. Prototype 935. Furman hadn't seen it yet. Prototype customer 935 at the Geneva show. This is just before the show opened, and the guy there was head of Porsche sales, Porsche passenger car sales, standing there sort of waiting for the crowds to come in thinking, who's gonna buy this? And of course they sold like water in the desert. First production, if you will, the very first 935, very first race, went out and ran away from everything, including the Ford Capri in the background. Another wonderful little story about Porsche and the 935. The 935s had to go through the same multiplier rule, so it was a 2.8-liter engine multiplied out to 4 liters for the classification for Group 5. They were the only ones who were ready for Group 5 in 1975. In 1976, they were still about the only ones ready, but by then the 935s had won so many races that the media and race organizers and race fans were saying, oh, these races are boring. And because they had no small car, they weren't running in the basically what would be now the GTU class, the under 2-liter class, which was still vigorously contested by BMW and Ford and a few other car makers. When Ernst Fuhrmann found out that German television was not going to broadcast the Group 5 race at Norrisring, but was going to broadcast the smaller engine displacement race, he said to his engineers, we cannot let this happen. They think we are chickens to run in the smaller class, we must build a car. The engineers said, sir, we're so busy, we can't really have the time. And he says, you do it. So Norbert and his colleagues created this car that earned the name Baby, because this is about an 8/10 scale 935. 1.4-liter engine with which turbos brings it to something like 1998 cc's, so it fit precisely in the rules. With only 1.4 turbocharged liters, it produced a mere 370 horsepower in a car that they lightened to 1,430 pounds. But of course, they did this in only 40 days, so they didn't really have any time to test it. The run at Norrisring, the gearing was wrong, the brakes weren't dialed in right. Jackie Hicks had a terrible time, finished 7th overall, and everybody said, neener, 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 you can't do small cars. So back to Weissach, they worked hard. When they showed up 2 weeks later at Hockenheimring, they had everything dialed in. It was an 85-mile race. Hicks finished 3 minutes ahead of second place. And Ernst Fuhrmann said, okay, we do this, it's good, put it in the museum, we don't race it again. 934, actually the first 934 in the US for Interscope Racing, Ted Field and Danny Angaias as drivers, maintained by Waszek Pollock. The first of the mutants. SCCA battled a new organization called IMSA for kind of control of racing in North America. One group would allow 934s, one group would not allow 935s, but if you kind of read the rules carefully, they led to this car, which was a 934 front end and a 935 back end. A car that earned the title of either the 934.5 or the 934.5. These things raced very aggressively in one series but not the other, and I'm sorry, I still can't get straight which was which. Full 935, one of the first and wildest of the Kramer 935s. The Kramer brothers, as I said, Monfort and Irwin, were very, very creative, very long time Porsche dealers and Porsche racers, with a partnership with another guy in Mannheim called Eckhard Zimmermann, who was an aerodynamicist and a body stylist and designer. And what I love about the Zimmermann cars, what they call the Kramer K series race cars, are these hard edges that really the Kramers used to great advantage to contain the airflow over the car. So that's a 935 K3. There's a 935 K3 jumping. I love the jumping pictures. So as you can see, all that airflow management just had no effect at all on keeping the car on the ground. 930 testing at Hockenheimring with the new, this is 78, so it's the new T-tray rear wing. Oh, in fact, there was a question yesterday about this. Where did the name Whale Tail came from? The name Whale Tail was a US marketing innovation. The Germans actually referred to that flat rear wing as the antlers. Full 935. My favorite 935. This was Norbert Singer's sort of thumb in the eye of the FIA inspectors. And I know that this is one of the cars Tony wanted me to talk about, because if you see the side door on this car, this big wide surface here and this enormous NACA duct here, the rules for 1978 and 935, well, in Group 5, were really wide open. Just about anything was possible. There were no restrictions on the width of the car. There were no restrictions on the height of the front fenders. There were no restrictions on pretty much anything. There was one rule that they were adamant about. The car had to have the original roof and the original back window. So we'll get to that in a moment. So Singer read the rules. Oh, the other one was that because all of the other competitors had front engines and exhausts running under the car, they felt they had a ground clearance and aerodynamic disadvantage because Porsche with the rear engine could drop it lower. So the rules said, okay, if you have a front engine car or you have any car that's going to race, you can drop the body down below the frame to enclose the exhaust. Singer looked at that and said, we can do that. So that thing has got about 2 inches, I think you'll see it better here, about no ground clearance. And you can see that's a group of students, so you can see that it's sort of the Porsche 935-40. It was about a meter tall. When the car raced, when it went through scrutineering, pre-scrutineering, Paul Frere, who was a great friend of Porsche and wrote a number of books about them, was one of the judges who came and said, no, Norbert, you can't do this. Well, we can. Well, but it's not allowed. No, Paul, it's not disallowed. And so finally, to just for Frere and his 2 other judges to sort of not totally lose face, Singer said, okay, we cut the doors open. So that's why you see these are cut back. What Frere objected to was just the fact that the car was just, as I said, just a total thumb in the eye of the FIA regulators. So the car ran in this livery. It ran, I think there was a race in the UK about 6 weeks before Le Mans, and it just scourged everybody. It was second overall, but it had hit the highest top speeds any car had ever done. Came back to the factory, they reworked a few things and sent it to Le Mans. It led the race for 7 hours. It was hitting speeds of 238 miles an hour on Lausanne in 1978. And it was only because on one of the pit stops, when X pulled in, they thought they noticed an oil leak under the rear case. And so they basically said, okay, X, just a little bit slower. So he slowed it down and he finished 7th overall. Got back and discovered it was a fluke. It was actually an oil splash from something totally unrelated to the engine. They could have gone like the hounds if hell were chasing them for all 24 hours. You saw the photograph a second ago of the car all in white with the white doors. They took that car in that condition to Paul Ricard for testing. When the thing came out of the transporter, it was an open testing day, so there were journalists there from many newspapers and many magazines. And when it rolled out of the transporter, one of the French journalists said, "Oh mon Dieu, it's Moby Dick." And that was the nickname for the car that stuck forever. So this is the 935-78 Moby Dick. You saw the 935 Model 2 Baby. The Germans love nicknames. 1978 Africa Safari 911 SC, full-on 935. Bruce Meyer's car, 1979 935 Kramer K3. This is the first production-derived car that won Le Mans since World War II, right? And possibly before that. But because it was based on a 911, they called it a production car. And this thing, again, private owners, ran like a top for all 24 hours. That car now belongs to a wonderful collector in Los Angeles, Bruce Meyer. In the US, there were IMSA GTU cars, meaning under 2.5 liters, and GTO cars, meaning over 2.5 liters displacement. Slightly different bodies. This is the GTO car, sort of seen from the front. You can look at these weird fenders. Okay, again, we have now the perfect aerodynamic exercise. There's the perfect Kramer car with the edge rails. Reinhold Jost was another privateer, incredibly successful 911 and 935 racer. And his solution, so he didn't get patent infringement suits or whatever it might have been, was to run his rails, his strakes, as they call them, up the center of the car to channel the air really up and over the center and over the roof. 935 K4, this was probably the orange Moby Dick because it was in Jagermeister colors. But this was the most bloated of the 935 race cars. 935 K3, world champion car and Le Mans winner. This was the customer car, and this is Andile's customer car, in fact, 935 K3. This is the IMSA GTX/GTP champion that John Paul Jr. and Sr. raced, father and son team. This car was based on a wrecked 912 platform and won Le Mans. This is Tony's favorite automobile of all, the beginning of the 959 saga. The concept of the 959 was to create a car, an all-wheel drive car that could do anything from drive you to the opera to drive you across the desert. So they called this thing Group B because that was the designation in racing which it fit. And I've talked to you about the FIA and the SCCA and IMSA with their GTUs and GTOs and RSs and RSRs. The FIA recalibrated everything for 1982, called it Group A, Group B, Group C. So Group A was regular production cars, Group B was turbocharged or normally aspirated, basically off-road racing cars, special cars, produce a minimum of 200 for homologation. And then Group C, as we know, became the 956. These were the flat-out prototype special race cars meant for the longest endurance races. But this was Group B, and this was the initial concept. So Steve Merkett, who actually went on to design the Cayenne and then had a lot to do with the Cayman, this was one of his concepts for the breadbasket rear spoiler, breadbasket handle rear spoiler. And then, of course, that was the Auto Show Group B car. Richard Soderberg, who was the head of design at that time, worked with Norbert Singer, and as you might see from the indented doorways, took a few lessons from Moby Dick about widening the front and rear fenders insanely, creating a huge rear wing, but keeping the original roof line and the door set. The most outrageous of the 935s were these 1982 Fab cars. Fab Car actually is an American race car fabrication company. And this was theirs. This was Bob Aiken's car, with which he wreaked havoc on the GTPCs. Thank you. 959, 1/5 scale clay model for the wind tunnel, where you begin to see how the shape of the car really related to, the Fab car and a few other amazing creations, with the doors inset and the breadbasket rear handle and the roof line. When they got to do the full-size clay model, they essentially took a production Carrera and padded it out with styrofoam and clay to make what the 959 body became. Interrupting all of that and going along at the same time, I told you earlier today I'm working on a book on Porsche racing history. And one of the big dilemmas with that book has been how to organize the book. Because in so many of these situations, the racing department has 3 or 4 different projects going on at the same time. When they had 906s, they also were in development with 907s and 910s for hill climbs. And of course, they had the 911R, and they had the beginnings of the ST and all the rest. This thing, which was the last of the SC chassis, into a special car, the 911 SC production car, into a special car called the SCRS. The SCRS was meant for Group B, rear drive, normally aspirated rallying. Type 953, the prototype all-wheel drive 911 SC that became the 959 running gear, became known as the Type 953. This is it going up a hill, and that's it coming down a hill. This is the start of Paris-Dakar 1986 with 3 of the 953s. They went on 86. The middle one, I think, was the one that went on to win, with Rene Medge at the wheel. 1985, they had a terrible year. 1986, no, I'm sorry, I'm off by a year. 87, they had a terrible year. 88, they went on to win. 959, prototype, winter testing. 959, prototype, wet weather testing at Weissach. Winter testing, that is Manfred Bantler, who was the project engineer working for Helmut Bott. On the car, you can see the entire passenger compartment is filled with electronic testing equipment. And there is Dr. Bott himself in one of the prototype 959s. You can see the whole thing. We've talked about suspension ride heights. This is a really good example because normally the car hunkers right down, but you can see here, it had a variable, actually it had an active suspension system, and it had a manual override. So you could raise the car up 60 millimeters, 2.5 inches, to add ground clearance. And so for some reason, Bott's got the whole thing jacked up on its tippy toes. When they began to consider the kind of livery that they would wear to Paris-Dakar, they also considered the fact that if the car broke down and the drivers were in a windstorm, they might have to literally bunker in. And so they gave a couple of the designers the assignment to figure out really how to secure the car. So this was Olivier Boulet's concept of, what the sort of 959 Paris-Dakar battle wagon would look like. And that's what the actual race car looked like. I joked with Tony once. I sent him an email with this picture, and I said, this looks like your shop on any typical day. Because there have been times when he's had 4 959s in the place. We spoke earlier about Barrow Carrosserie, the Bauer Body Works that did 906s and then did 911R body work and then did the 959s. This is Bauer's Works. 959 Paris-Dakar car, rebuild before going off in Paris-Dakar. This is the 961, which was a 959 with endurance bodywork, meant for Le Mans. But there was no Le Mans racing class for all-wheel drive, so they called this Group X. Again, one more of these sets of letters that goes with the thing that just makes Porsche designations an alphabet nightmare. At Le Mans in 1986, had some success, 231 miles an hour on the Mulsanne, 7th overall. I think it was 7th overall. At the time that they were still working on the 959s, they began creating the successor to the Carreras, which was going to be the 964 series. They had decided to try to carry over some of the design traits of the 959, and they created the 964 Turbo Series, which was designated the 965. So it's another Olivier Boulay concept. Again, with the breadbasket rear end, he did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of design sketches along with Steve Merkett and a couple of other stylists to create what was going to be the next 911 Turbo. They produced 7 prototypes. One of them's here in the Porsche Museum storage, but you can see there's the breadbasket. I should have thought to add a sort of a 3/4 front view of the car, because the 3/4 front view of the car is precisely and exactly 993, like what we have back there. 961 for Le Mans in 1988. 87, sorry. In 87, there was a slight mechanical error. The car went backwards into the Armco at very high speed, ruptured the turbo, leaked oil, and as the driver was pulling away, the whole thing erupted in flames. Driver got out fine, car burned to the ground. We talked a couple hours ago about the 959 Comfort, the all-leather car, and the 959 Sport. This is the one that's much less often seen in the US. This is the interior of a 959 Sport model. You see no radio, full roll cage, cloth seats, snap-in carpet. 964 Cup Race at Hockenheim. Another one of the oddballs of Porsche construction. This is the Carrera 4 Lightweight. It was an invention of Jürgen Barth. He found 35 sets of running gear for 959s and 953s and decided, what if I put them in a 964? Will it work? And he built he built one as a prototype. It immediately sold, even though there was no racing class for it, and it became this instant collectible. The strange thing was, at the same time this was going on, Roland Kussmaul and Helmut Flegel were creating the first 964 Cup cars, for which there was a series. So Porsche, trying to keep the peace between, one head of customer racing and, the other head of customer racing, said, okay, we set prices. So the Cup cars, they go for 109,000 Deutschmarks. Herr Barth, you charge 189,000 for your Carrera 4 Lightweight. An extra 80,000 for front-wheel drive. So the first 3 people who got their cars had a heart attack when the final price came in. The last of these cars lingered at Weissach until '92. And Barth kept sending these dunning letters. You have a contract with us, we will take you to court. Finally, the last one sold 5 years after the first one sold. They are now an insanely hot collectible, and these things go for $500,000. Because there were only 20. They were the ugly red-headed stepchild of Weissach Motorsports. They hold the dubious distinction of being the absolute loudest car Porsche Motorsports ever created. I don't know the decibel number, but it's sort of like ears bleed. The C4 Lightweight body helped develop this, which was the 911S Le Mans, which then helped develop this, which was the Turbo S, which came out in '92. It was a brainchild of Rolf Sprenger, who was basically at that point the head of Special Wishes, the custom department. And Sprenger had watched a lot of custom work go to Louis Roof and to B&B and to a couple others of the custom tuners in Germany. And some of his good customers said, why don't you do that? And so Sprenger went to the board of directors and said, why don't we do that? And they said, okay, you try. So he basically started with the 911S Le Mans platform and then made it civilized. So it had sort of a full 959 luxury interior, but it was called the Turbo S. And when they debuted the car, Sprenger knew enough to not designate colors or design a body, so he went to Lagai, and the guy said, we create something special. And when the guy pulled the covers off the car, Sprenger said, Herr Lagai, Ferrari fly yellow is not a Porsche color. And the guy leaned into him and said, it is if we call it speed yellow. Carrera RS 964, another insanely wonderful collectible. Wasn't allowed in the US. 964 GT America racing car. This is what followed the 964 RS. This is the RSA for RS America. It was one of the first times when Porsche produced a very special car for less than the regular car. They've never made that mistake since. This is a decontented car that actually sold for $5,000 less than the standard Carrera 2. The standard Carrera 2 had the articulated rear lifter. This was the whale tail. Well, this was the T-tray. This was $45,000. The standard Carrera 2 was $50,500. They produced, I think, 700 of these in all, and these now also are a rocket ship in terms of ascending value. But as I said, Porsche never made that mistake again. Take content out, put price in. Another GT America. This is the Brumos car at Daytona. Carrera 3.8 RSR for the Super Cup Series. The Super Cup Series was run in coordination. In the US, it was run in coordination with IndyCar events. In Europe, it ran with Formula One events. That led to the Porsche GT, which was another designation for the GT2, which I think this is, yes. So the yellow one was the race car. This was the series production car with the fancy sort of mutant bolt-on fenders. You can see the really rough crude, but the whole idea was to make it feel like for your extra $50,000, you're getting a race car. So 993 Super Cup car. 993 GT2 with our friend Jeff Zwart at the wheel on his way to a class win at Pikes Peak. 993 GT2R. 993 GT2 Le Mans. In these, no, this is the Evo. And that's sort of what brings me finally. The car in the back is a GT1. And that whole new designation of GT1, 2, 3, 4 that used to be Group 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 came when the FIA had kind of fallen on hard times in 1992, 93. Jürgen Barth retired in 94, and he got together with two close friends, Patrick Peter and Stefan Rattel. So it's Barth, Peter, Rattel. And they took their first initials and created a racing series called BPR. The whole concept of BPR was to make racing affordable again and to keep the companies out, the manufacturers out. The idea was buy something like this, a GT2, a turbocharged GT car for GT2. GT3 was normally aspirated GT cars, GT4. A class that really never even existed in the 90s. It was on paper, but there were no races for GT4s. That was smaller displacement, higher production cars. And GT1 was the ultimate, the top of the heap, meant for special prototypes, but built by privateers and individuals. And it was a very noble idea, and there were about none made until Gordon Murray showed up with a McLaren F1 LM. And Tony showed us photographs of that earlier on. Porsche raced these GT2s and GT2 Evos in GT1 class because there were so few entries in the early days that there was really not enough to field an entire race. So the BPR, because Barth was part of it, said, yeah, sure, you GT2 guys, you come in. And really, it led directly to the creation of this car, the GT1. This was the one road-going 96 GT1 road-going version out playing in traffic. Some preliminary sketches. This was some of Tony Hatter's first work on what the car was going to look like. And then, of course, we know the racing history. Into production, this is 96 production. I think I have 97 Series 2 production here. The next one is 98 production, the final year. when, as Tony Hatter said, it looked nothing like a 911, but we put the headlights on. And there it is with the headlights, and oh, come on, there it is winning at Le Mans. And there this one is. So that's the all too long and entirely too complicated history of Porsche's alphabet soup.